World Art and Culture, Lesson 1, Section 1. The birth of man, the birth of religion, the birth of art. In this section we will discuss the development of humanity from its first beginnings up to the development of agriculture. We're going to identify basically some characteristics that differentiate humans from the rest of the species of nature. Particularly we're going to be interested in language and image making, two very unique qualities that seem to be unique to humans. Remember, humanity itself is quite a small part of natural history. The context of humanity, its relative age is quite small. Humanity is but a dot in the spectrum of natural history. The universe probably is at least 13 billion years old. Life itself, 4 billion years old. Whereas us humans, of course, have been here only relatively maybe 40 million years. Again, we're gonna think about what makes humans human. That's sort of the theme of our course, and the production of human culture will be the sort of object of study. And of course, this begins perhaps with language itself. Language is unique again to humans. We know that other animals communicate. They communicate quite efficiently. We're not concerned with communication here, but with the unique type of communication that only humans seem to have developed. This interesting way of communicating through words, through linguistic signs, eventually through written symbols. Language, remember, is a kind of substitute for things. We use words to represent thoughts, to represent ideas. We use words to represent things, to represent actions. Language, again, is a type of representation, and we might want to think about what that word means. Representation literally means, of course, to represent, to bring something back, to represent something that is absent. This is an interesting notion if we understand that this is basic to language. Language represents, it brings back, it presents again something that isn't there, something that is absent. Again, a word is a kind of substitute for a thought, for a thing. And again, unless we can interview an animal and ask him or her about how they communicate, we really don't know how animals communicate. But it doesn't seem like they communicate using representation, at least the way we do. So human representation is perhaps the primordial differentiation between humans and the rest of the species of nature. And it probably is as old as man. We're not sure when language was developed, but perhaps as far back as maybe 40 million years ago, humans began to communicate through gestures, perhaps eventually using phonetic sounds, grunts, perhaps pointing, sort of spatial signs, developed into pronouns, and eventually we developed verbs and nouns, sort of names for things. All of these, though, function in the same way. They function as substitutes or representations for thoughts, for actions, for things. There's an element of substitution to language that we need to be aware of. And again, this seems to be unique to human beings. What else is unique to humans? Well, we believe that humans also seem to be the only species to be conscious of time, or let's say conscious of temporality, in a way that affects their everyday life. And this, of course, probably goes back to the primordial human uniquely human interest in death. As far as we know, only humans are conscious of death. Um, Animals, we know, mourn for the dead and perhaps understand death in some capacity, but they certainly do not obsess over it or have been involved in its representation and its analysis the way humans have since the beginning of humanity. Humans seem to be conscious of death, and it seems that the consciousness of death develops in human history perhaps as far back as maybe 100 million years ago. The evidence for this consciousness of death, of course, are human burials. Humans begin to bury the dead somewhere around at least 100,000 years ago, but this is probably something that was going on for quite a while before. The burial of the dead, of course, tells us that humans were conscious of some notion of an afterlife. Perhaps, as some have theorized, humans' ability to dream was perhaps the kind of the seed of this notion of an afterlife, which of course will lead eventually to the notion of a spiritual realm, a soul. Humans, of course, probably bury the dead for practical reasons, but we have to understand that in the end, burial is a kind of a ritual that is connected to some understanding, some notion of an afterlife. This seems to be, again, unique to humans. The interest or the question about where we came from, who are we, what are we, and of course, where are we going? These are basic questions of religious consciousness, and again, they seem to be unique to humans. What's very interesting as we study this early human history is that about the same time, more or less, that humans begin to bury their dead, let's say 100,000 years ago, which they do in a special way, in a unique way, in a significant way, with objects, in significant places, in significant positions. Around the same time is the time when we're going to see the first images, and the burial of the dead seem to have developed about more or less around the same time, which raises some very interesting questions. Again, the burial of the dead, we can say, is connected to the beginning of human consciousness of death, the birth of human religion, religious consciousness, the first human ideas about the spiritual realm, about a possible afterlife, about a sacred entity, a sacred world, a sacred deity. Around the same time, then, we also see the first human images. So let us talk about images for a minute here. Images, of course, are also a type of representation. They are also substitutes for something that isn't there. An image is basically a substitute for same thing as language, a thought, a thing, an idea. The difference, of course, is that images have a very universal dimension, which is they resemble what they represent. They simply they are simply much more universal in the fact that they look like or resemble, even in their most crude way, they resemble what they represent. And again, remembering what representation means, to bring back something again, to substitute or present something that is absent. An image does this in the same way, in one way the same way, but in a significant way. An image is much more universal because it actually resembles what it represents. Even a circle with two dots, the most basic sort of image, is in some ways representing while resembling the object it represents, a human face. Images are unique to humans. No other species makes images, makes representations of other things. Again, we have to be careful not to simply sort of say this is a product of human intelligence or human evolution, that humans are smarter, that humans have a dexterity to draw, which is the reason why they make images. We're more interested here in the function of these images. Why images? The simple cliche would be that humans wanted to express or communicate through images, but that doesn't seem to be a necessary issue, particularly in this world where violence was so prevalent and people had many things to worry about other than expressing themselves. We have a tremendous clue to the possible function of images given when they occur. They seem to occur more or less simultaneously with the burial of the dead, around 100,000 years ago. Now this would of course imply that there's a relationship between images and the burial of the dead, which on a deeper level would mean that there's a relationship between image making, human image making, and their consciousness of death. And that's what we believe is the relationship, that somehow these images functioned in some way as a ritual related to death, to human religious consciousness. So the question might be, how exactly do they relate? Well, remember what kind of world that these humans are living in. This is a very violent world, a world of constant, everyday violence, a sort of cycle of violence, of bloodletting, really. Survival is necessitated through killing, through the killing of animals, as we said. Hunting is part of life. The killing of animals is necessary for survival. We know that these nomadic people had no other way of surviving except through killing. This was a violent world. Life itself was connected to death at a very basic level. Killing, violence, death were all related. And the source of life, in a way, was killing, the killing of animals through the hunt. So perhaps what these images did, because from the evidence we have, most of the images of early man are of animals of the hunt. So perhaps the theory is that they function perhaps to substitute, to replace the animals that were being killed in some magical way, as substitutes, as representations. These images of the animals perhaps helped bring back, not just symbolically but literally bring back, the animals for which humans depended. Now this raises the other issue that's connected to all this, which is the issue of human guilt. Perhaps also at this time humans began to feel guilty about having to kill animals. They understood that animals suffered. Human empathy perhaps developed first of all towards other creatures, the creatures that they had to kill to survive, and this maybe led to a kind of guilt consciousness, which we know is very much connected to religion, to religious thought. This guilt, or this empathy, this remorse over the necessity of killing animals, perhaps over many years led to a kind of ritual where making images of animals perhaps function to replenish, to replace, to repay for the animals that are being killed. One of the sort of characteristics of magic is substitution itself, what is called sympathetic magic. Like creates like, or like affects like. And again, these are just hypotheses. We have no way of knowing if this is true or not. Perhaps humans used images to substitute for the animals, magically, symbolically, the animals that they were killing, perhaps believing that if they replace the animals will come back. Remember that these humans, again, lived in a very violent world, probably moving from place to place rather regularly. We could probably say that early man saw nature as something terrifying and identified with it, some kind of sacred power, terrifying nonetheless, but sacred. Remember that violence was part of life in a way that we can't even imagine. The hunt itself was a violent activity that probably developed into a ritual or surrounded itself with ritualistic activity, which of course is religious activity. We know from studies of so-called primitive cultures that the hunt and religion, the hunt itself is considered a kind of ritual, and that the animal world, the natural world, is considered sacred, perhaps a dimension of the sacred that has to be understood, communicated with, and perhaps even appeased through perhaps magic. And again, perhaps in this world of early man, image making functioned to relieve the guilt and somehow to communicate with the spiritual realm of nature, a nature that was of course needed for survival, although it was also the location of tremendous violence. Keep in mind also that in this early world of man, women and children were probably not necessarily function in any way to in a positive way. Women and children were probably quite a burden back then. Not until the domestication of animals and the development of agriculture are children and women going to be an important part of this, of early human culture. Most of the images that have been found, of course, have been found in caves, which is where these people lived. We might speculate that image making was, as we said, related to a ritual connected to the hunt, to spiritual ideas connected with the afterlife. We might perhaps speculate that the first priests, the first shaman, the first sort of religious figures in these early communities perhaps were the artists, the ones who could draw the images on these caves. Perhaps there was a ritual involved, a kind of initiation into the hunt related to image making. As far as other human cultural productions, of course, human technology probably predates images. The first human technologies were probably simple hand axes, many of which would survive. These simple tools probably used for cutting the meat off the bone, for removing the skin and the fur off the animals, were the first human sort of artifacts. They seem to have been somewhat ergonomically created, and there's also evidence of a kind of artistic symmetry that these first tools embodied. Symmetry seems to be kind of a universal human trait. These first technologies, of course, were related to the hunt and to survival through the hunting of animals. Again, keep in mind that this early history of humanity, we're talking here from about 40 million years ago to maybe 10,000, 20,000 years ago, is mostly a life of nomadic violence, where women and children are not necessarily a commodity, a positive influence on life. They were probably of minor importance, and only in contrast to their later function. The majority of images found, again, date from around 100,000 years ago, and they are found in caves, and they seem to have been, again, simultaneous with the first human burials, hence the first evidence of human religion, human sacred consciousness. And again, all of this probably based on the consciousness of death, which again is unique to humans. We know that these images were probably being done for quite a while, because eventually they become quite sophisticated. Human beings are rarely shown, and when they are shown in these early images, they are usually quite crude, almost abstract. At times they have a characteristic of maybe of a hybrid figure, perhaps like this image here, perhaps a depiction of one of these priests or shaman who were given the special duties of creating the images. Again, if the images function in a religious context of redemption of guilt, of human communication with the sacred, the people making the images would have been considered significant, sacred themselves. Again, perhaps the first image makers, the first artists, were priests, shaman, etc. What's characteristic about these early human images is, again, the sophistication of the depiction of animals as opposed to the humans. Human beings are usually depicted in quite crude, almost stick-like figures, whereas animals are much more detailed, foreshortened, and in general much more naturalistic. Perhaps this is evidence of the importance of the animal as a sacred symbol, as a sacred figure. Don't forget that this would have been labor intensive. Humans would have had to create pigments, perhaps out of blood, out of charcoal, out of other natural materials. In some instances, these cave paintings, cave drawings, are in positions that would have necessitated scaffolding, which would have been very difficult to create, obviously, because there was a lack of trees at this time. All of this just points to the importance, the significance of these images. We can't simply say these were art in our modern sense of expressive human representations. These images would have had to have functioned in a religious context, in some kind of, again, magical rite of replenishment, substitution, magical redemption. And we can see that these are quite sophisticated images, which probably means that there was a tradition going back quite a while. Don't forget, this was also done in caves, which means that there would have been a need for light. Humans began to control fire pretty early in their history, and they probably used torches and lamps fueled with animal fat while they created these images. It's interesting again to hypothesize about the relative absence of humans in these early representations. They're mostly of animals, and almost exclusively of animals of the hunt. So again, humanity begins to develop maybe 40 million years ago. Language seems to have been the earliest type of unique human communicative structure, unique to humans in its unique symbolic, substitutive way of communication. Images, another type of representation, develop about 100,000 years ago. Significantly, they develop around the same time that humans develop some consciousness of death, consciousness of the sacred, hence religious consciousness. The burial of the dead is the evidence we have for this, and the theory is that the first human images were probably part of a sacred ritual connected to the perhaps guild-ridden activity of killing, which was a necessity for survival at this time. Perhaps these images function to again substitute, magically replace, or otherwise replenish the animals that humans needed for survival. Now all of this is going to change dramatically. In some instances around 10,000 years ago, perhaps 12,000 years ago. So we're talking about, from the beginning of the first humans 40 million years ago. Quite a long time will pass, and then humans will begin a new stage in their history, a tremendous shift, a revolution in human development will occur around 10,000 years before the birth of Christ. The development, the invention, or maybe perhaps simply the discovery of agriculture, a huge shift in human history. Agriculture will affect every part of human life. It will change the way humans not just live, but it will change their attitude towards themselves, their attitude about humanity. It will certainly have a monumental effect on humans' attitude towards nature, and of course towards life itself. And the invention or discovery, development of agriculture will significantly change the direction of human religious consciousness, the way humans think about the sacred, about the supernatural world of the sacred will change significantly after the invention of agriculture. Again, beginning around 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago. Agriculture doesn't develop at the same time in the same places. It probably developed somewhere in the Middle East or in Northern Africa, perhaps Southeastern Europe, around 10,000 years ago. This doesn't happen overnight. Obviously, it took probably hundreds of years of trial and error. We probably don't know how. We don't know how agriculture was developed. It was probably a combination of accident and experiment. But the activity of humans planting seeds and growing food will have immeasurable effects on humanity. Agriculture, of course, will make it necessary to settle. There will no longer be a need to move around chasing animals. Human beings for the first time will now begin to settle in places. Let's look at what agriculture actually is. Agriculture, of course, is time-based. It's a process that takes time. Seeds have to be planted. They have to be kept and cultivated, and eventually crops grow, and they are harvested, and people, of course, will use them for nourishment. Again, this necessitates, for the first time in human history, the settlement of human communities. These are going to be the first human settlements, the first true human cultures. It's no coincidence that the word culture and cultivation have the same roots. Agriculture necessitates settlements, which necessitates place. We will now have the first human places. The first humans in history will begin to identify with their place, with the land. We are not yet at the time of civilization, but we do have now the first sort of combination of place, traditions, cultivation, and perhaps the beginning of our first true human communities. So what does this do to the human consciousness? What does this do to humanity? Well, first of all, of course, this is going to be a much more peaceful world. The end of nomadic hunting, not to say that this ends overnight, people will still hunt, but agriculture enables humans now to have a much more peaceful relationship with nature, obviously. Nature now becomes something you cultivate, something you procure, something you keep. Nature is now something you work with. Humans will have now a much more symbiotic relation with nature. As they settle, they will become identified with their land. They will build the first settlements. Agriculture obviously will awaken humans to the role of time, of cosmic time, of natural time. People will now develop the first calendars, the first ideas of the seasons. Spring, of course, will be forever connected to the planting of seeds. Hence, the tremendously powerful symbolism of spring as a beginning, as a birth. It will become the season of, obviously, of love, of fertility itself. The summer will be connected to the growing season, and of course the fall to harvest. The seasons and the passing of time will now have tremendous significance for human beings like never before. The sun, of course, itself will be incredibly significant and symbolically important. And the other four corners of the earth, the so-called cardinal points will be identified: north, south, east, and west. And the passing of time will forever be connected to life itself. The cycle of the seasons of the year is connected to, of course, agriculture. So we could say that with settlements now we have not only a connection to place, but a relationship to nature now that is, again, much more peaceful, cooperative. Humans, of course, will now have to save food. They will develop technologies of baskets, basket weaving, and of course pottery, to be used for storing food through the winter. The storage of food becomes a huge part of the agricultural world. Again, connected to this idea of the seasons. And of course, the other monumental shift will be the human relationship to animals. This is the other dimension of this new relationship to nature that humans will have with the advent of agriculture. Animals will now be domesticated. The domestication of animals is again a monumental shift in the relationship between humans and nature. Animals will now be used. Animals will now be part of human communities. Dogs, chickens, pigs, and other animals will be domesticated. Human breeding of animals will begin. Human husbandry of animals. Animals will now be caught and used in a much more peaceful, again, symbiotic way. Hunting is still part of human life, of course, but is not the only way of nourishment. Animals are now used for more than just as meat. They're used to, of course, their milk is used for nourishment. Their other byproducts of animals are used by humans now, and most importantly, humans become, literally and figuratively familiar to human beings. The domestication of animals, of course, coincides with the advent of agriculture, and it is a huge part of this new relationship that humans will have with nature. Animals are now harnessed and procured for labor as well as for food. Animals become part of human technological advancements. Animals will be used for transportation eventually. They will be used for harnessing energy, etc. In the images that we see from the advent of agriculture, from 10,000 BC or so, we see the new relationship. Animals are shown now literally incorporated into human life. Images of animals used in farming, for perhaps transportation, for pulling primitive plows. Animals are shown as procuring energy for mills and other early technologies. This, of course, is going to change, as we said, the relationship between animals and humans. Will change the perspective of humanity towards the sacred. Remember, before the advent of agriculture, nature was a violent dimension of life. Life itself was violent, and nature had to be violently communicated in a way, or humans had to communicate violently through nature, through their killing of animals, hence their perhaps magical religious worship of animals, or need to represent them through images. But now with agriculture, with the cultivation of land, with settlements, with places, we see a different religious consciousness appear. And of course this has to do with the deep analogy that is going to be made between agriculture and the feminine principles of life. With the advent of agriculture, we have a beginning of this idea of Mother Earth, of Earth, nature herself as a woman. The analogies, of course, are quite powerful. Agriculture itself is a sort of fertilization of the earth through seeds. The fertile ground then gives birth to plants and crops, and this cycle, of course, is repeated over and over again. So we can go through the analogies here between the feminine principle and agriculture. fertility, seeds, cultivation. The cycle of agriculture is connected to the cycle of the woman, of the menstrual cycle. Again, nature is seen as a woman, Mother Earth. Fertility is a principle equal to women and nature. And of course, there's also this idea that develops that women, in a way, are connected to the seasons, to the cycle of life in a way that is unique. Women have a connection to the moon and to the cycle of time that is different than men's, obviously. This, of course, from the evidence that we have, is going to develop into a religion of fertility, or a cult of fertility. The religious images that we have now, after the advent of agriculture, are no longer images of hunting, of hunted animals, but are going to be of fertility, so-called fertility figures, fertility symbols, like this one here. These are very consistent, and they are more or less temporally consistent throughout areas where agriculture develops. These so-called fertility figures are basically symbolic representations of the principles of fecundity, fertility, agriculture. These fertility figures are, like this one here, usually exaggerated versions of a sort of symbolic woman, not really identified as an individual, with large breasts, large thighs, large hips, symbolizing, of course, fertility. The hands are usually above the breasts, and the genitalia is also prominent. There are no feet on these figures, which tells us they were probably used maybe to stick in the ground, to literally fertilize the ground, perhaps used in, not perhaps, but most definitely used in religious rituals having to do with the fertilization of the land. And of course, here we have the crystallized notion of Mother Earth. Nature as a woman, fertility. And again, this is a clear analogy to the nature of agriculture itself. Fertility becomes the sacred symbol, the sacred concept, feminine fertility, during the early advent of agriculture. The other thing that happens with the development of agriculture is, of course, as we mentioned, the settlement of people. People begin to create places. For the first time in human history, humans will identify themselves with place, with a location. And slowly but definitely, human generations will begin to identify themselves with their land, with their place, and of course, obviously, with the people who have lived in that land. So we have the beginning here of a kind of ancestral, place-oriented identity of people to their land, and perhaps also to their blood. Groups of people will identify now with particular places. This is the beginning of course, what eventually will be human civilization, human states, human identity based on land, place, and blood. The most significant structures that humans begin to build very soon after the advent of agriculture are basically symbolic structures, or so-called centers. As we see from evidence from this early agricultural period, or the so-called Neolithic period, which is usually the term used for the period beginning with the advent of agriculture, Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, being the term used for the period before this, the period of early man before the advent of agriculture. In the so-called Neolithic period, or period of agriculture, we have these interesting structures built in specific places and significant places by early human agricultural settlements. These centers are, the first ones seem to be consistently built of significant materials, particularly stones, particularly large megalithic structures that seem to have been markers of some kind of sacred centers. We'll talk about centers later on in more detail, but these first human, let's call them first human architectural monuments, seem to have been connected to either a supernatural or sacred event or place that needed to be marked significantly, perhaps to be used as literally a religious center, a place of pilgrimage. The significance of these places, of course, these centers, are primarily based on the difficulty of their construction. Upright stones or large structures of megalithic dimensions are common in these early agricultural communities. And Stonehenge, of course, is one of the most well-known. This is an early agricultural center, a religious center, perhaps a place of pilgrimage during specific times of the seasons related to the cycle of the agricultural year, perhaps a place for sacrifices or other offerings to the deities. Stonehenge is a type of center of which there are others in various early agricultural settlements, and they seem to all have the same kind of function: a ritual space, perhaps connected to a supernatural event, but also connected to the cosmic orientation of the corners of the earth, of the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. Stonehenge perhaps probably is a cosmic calendar, a kind of stone megalithic clock that perhaps was used in, again, agricultural rituals, perhaps during specific seasonal moments to procure the cultivation of crops, etc. What Stonehenge and other similar cosmic centers tell us is, obviously, now that the human consciousness towards the sacred is now much more of a cosmic consciousness, much more directed towards nature as a force, perhaps divided into Mother Nature or Earth herself, and then the cosmic powers of the stars and the moon and obviously the sun. They all of them having in common this cluster of ideas connected to agriculture and the feminine principle. As we'll see, this is sort of a small anomaly in the history of humanity, perhaps, because soon after this, within 5,000-6,000 years, we will have another shift in human consciousness towards nature, towards the sacred, when civilization proper is created, and we will see a very different development in human culture, much more centered on male, patriarchal, sacred symbols than these feminine principles that we briefly covered in this section. We will begin discussing this so-called beginning of the so-called civilization in our next section, which will take us to Mesopotamia.